Hello everybody, Rob Mize with you once again. And on the advice of my son, I'm branding this as a boomer tutorial to distinguish the efforts of this old-timer from the contributions of the more contemporary producers. Obviously, subtlety is not the theme here. Nonetheless, if you're ready for a simple technique to reveal text, logos, or other elements into your compositions, then let's get started. I have this 1920 by 1080 composition with a text layer already prepared, and I'll just drag this video onto our timeline to serve as our background, and you'll see After Effects conveniently and automatically adds it to the timeline and our project. Let's drag it under the text, and I think it shows that our text needs to pop a little bit more. We could add an outline or drop shadow to the text, or blur or color correct the background to make the text more readable. But in this case, we'll create a glass type panel to lift the text off the background, and we'll add some of those other techniques as well. I want to reveal these bullet points individually, and I want the panel to animate with them, so we'll use a mask to accomplish this. Select the text and double-click the rounded rectangle tool to create a comp size mask. The mask should be in the Add mode. Notice it's to the upper left of the composition. This is because the text layer isn't centered in the comp. Just double-click the mask and adjust the size and position to accommodate the text. To create our panel, right-click in the timeline and select Create a New Solid. I'll create a white comp size solid and name this layer Panel and move it under our text. Select the text layer and hit MM to reveal the mask properties. Select the mask path and use Command C to copy the text layer mask, and then select the panel layer and use Command V to paste the mask there. You'll notice the masks don't yet line up because the position of the two layers is different. Since these layers have to work in concert with each other, we're going to link their mask paths and position with an expression. And since the text is the primary element in the composition, we'll use it to control all the action. But we have a few adjustments to make first. And a note here. Command on a Mac equates to Control on a PC. Option on a Mac equates to Alt on a PC. So now that I've said that, I don't really need to repeat that every time, I don't think. Okay, back in our timeline, select the text and panel layers and hit MM to reveal the mask parameters. Option-click the Mask Path stopwatch on the panel layer and pick whip it to the mask path of the text layer to link these masks by expression. Now select both layers and hit P to reveal the position parameters. Again, Option-click the panel's position stopwatch and pick whip it to the text layer's position. The masks now line up, but what has happened to our panel? When we linked its position to the text, the edges of the solid no longer fill the mask. What to do? The simplest solution is to use a larger solid. But you can't just scale it up because the mask scales with it. Instead, let's create a new comp using the 4K preset to create a comp that's twice the size of our original composition. Right-click the timeline and choose Create a New Solid. Make it comp size, and let's name it White Solid 4K. While we're here, let's also create a new 4K adjustment layer, which we'll use a bit later. Back in our text panel composition, select the panel layer in the timeline. Also select the new layer, White Solid 4K we just created, that's in the project panel, and Option drag it over the panel layer in the timeline to replace the original 2K solid with the new 4K solid. And notice the mask and other parameters stay intact. Now the masks are lined up as we need them, and there's plenty of solid to fill our composition. Select the new panel layer and hit MM to reveal the mask parameters, and let's reduce the mask opacity to about 40%. Let's add a change to color effect and change this to kind of a glassy blue, and select Change all the color elements, hue, lightness, and saturation. We could have created a solid the same color, but the change to color effect lets us quickly change the panel to whatever color we choose. Add a bevel alpha effect to give the panel a look of thickness, and add a generate light sweep effect for some highlight. And let's also add a subtle drop shadow just to separate the panel from the background video. While we're at it, I'm going to choose the text and panel layers and hit T to reveal the opacity parameters. Option-click the panel transparency stopwatch and pick whip it to the transparency of our text layer to link them by expression. Notice that the mask opacity of the panel is 40%, which allows it to remain somewhat translucent even though the opacity of the layer itself is 100%. Now, I want the glass panel to distort the background behind it, and we'll accomplish this by using the adjustment layer we created earlier. As you know, effects added to an adjustment layer are applied to all the layers beneath it. And for this to work the way we want, the adjustment layer needs the same mask, positioning, and opacity as our text and panel layers. Let's save ourselves a few mouse clicks and keystrokes and select the panel layer and use Command D to duplicate it. Select the lower panel layer in the timeline. Next, select the 4K adjustment layer in the project panel, and again, hold down the Option key and drag it over the selected panel layer in the timeline. Remember, we created this 4K adjustment layer for the same reasons we used the 4K solid for the panel, so that it would fill up the composition even if it were moved off the center of the comp in order to match the position of the text. Now the adjustment layer has replaced the duplicate panel with all its parameters intact. Hit UU to reveal these parameters that are not in the default value, and you can see that the mask path, position, and opacity parameters have expressions already in place linking them to the text layer. On our adjustment layer, hit E to reveal our effects. And let's delete the effects on the panel layer we replaced and bring the mask opacity back up to 100%. Click the adjustment layer box so that we see the effects we'll add to this layer, but not the adjustment layer itself. I'll add a Gaussian blur effect set to about 20 and also a color correction curve to darken the background behind and beneath the panel that's above it. If we look at only the adjustment layer in the background, we can see how the effects from the adjustment layer are visible on the background inside the adjustment layer's mask. Experiment with various effects to get the look you want. Now let's start working on our animation. Select the text layer, hit MM, and click the mask path stopwatch to add a keyframe and drag it further down the timeline. Lasso the mask's bottom vertices and move them upward until the bottom of the mask lines up with the top. Zoom in for a closer look to match these as closely as possible. I use the up and down cursor keys to nudge this into position. You'll see as you make this change, another keyframe is automatically added. Now I think we can appreciate the advantage of this technique. As we move forward from the first keyframe in our mask path, we see the mask animate, revealing the glass panel, the text, and the effects from the adjustment layer. Our adjustments for all three layers are controlled by the keyframes on the text layer. However, if we scroll in to look closely at the start of our animation, we see the corners of the rounded rectangle creating these artifacts. Let's fix this by adding an opacity keyframe to the text layer, and then either drag it or use the Option right cursor keys to move that keyframe 3 frames forward on the timeline. Now change the opacity to 0 to automatically add another keyframe. Again, because of the expression links we added earlier, the opacity of the linked layers animates with the text mask. Now make sure these first keyframes line up with the end point of the text layer. Next, let's synchronize our animation to the audio. I'll drag my voiceover file onto the timeline, and again it's automatically added to the project folder. Add LL to show the waveform. I'll place the audio to start at the 2-second mark on the timeline, and then preview it to determine where our animation begins. Using After Effects, we're able to enhance our text over video using masks and expressions, and also adjustment layers and effects. You can also use Command-click to scrub the audio. I want it to start right here when we hear After Effects. So I'll select the text, panel, and adjustment layers and move them to this cue point where the animation begins. I want the reveal of this first line to take 20 frames, so I'll press Command-Shift and hit right cursor once, then twice, to move the timeline cursor 20 frames forward in the timeline, where I want the line of text revealed. Now we could certainly select the mask and adjust its path, but here's an alternative method to consider. Select the second mask keyframe and move it closer or further to the first keyframe. You'll see the mask change. You're basically changing the duration of the animation, and in so doing, changing the mask path at that particular position on the timeline. Adjust the position of the keyframe so the mask path reveals the first bullet point. When it's in the position you want, either click the Add Keyframe icon or use Option M to add a keyframe to the mask path. Now, I'll use Option Command-click to make this a hold keyframe, which will maintain this mask path until it reaches the next keyframe in the timeline. Find the next animation cue in the audio where you want the second line revealed, and either click or use Option M to add the next keyframe, which will automatically be a hold keyframe and have the same value as the hold keyframe before it. At this point, we want our animation to continue, so use Command-click to change this hold keyframe to a linear keyframe. Move 20 frames forward in the timeline. I'll use Command-Shift and hit the right cursor key once, twice, to move to that point. And again, move the mask's end keyframe forward or backward to adjust the mask path to reveal the second bullet. And either click or use the Option M shortcut to add a keyframe here, and Option Command-click to make it a hold keyframe. Find your next animation cue in the audio and repeat these steps as necessary. Using After Effects, we're able to enhance our text over video using masks and expressions, and also adjustment layers and effects. Another adjustment I made was to feather the text layer mask about 10 pixels and change the mask expansion to about -8. I think the cutoff of the text looks a bit better this way, but make the adjustments that work for your projects. Obviously, there are countless ways to modify this technique, and experiment with combinations of effects on the adjustment layer to create the look you want. I hope you found something useful in this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing how you put these ideas to work. So until our next Boomer tutorial, this is Rob Mize wishing you happy compositing.